Today's date is September the 15th, 2005. We're at the Warhawk Air Museum in Nampa, Idaho. Today, we're interviewing George Leonard Williams as part of the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Library of Congress. My name is Barry Hill, and I'll be conducting the interview. Also present in the room is Allie Hill, director and cameraman. Mr. Williams, welcome. May I call you Lenny?
Yes.
Please give us your full name and the location where you were born.
My full name is George Leonard Williams. I was born June the 16th, 1922 in Jordan Valley, Oregon.
And what branch of the service did you serve?
U.S. Army Air Corps.
And which war did you serve in?
That would be World War II.
Lenny, you grew up in this area. Can you tell us a little bit about what life was like back then?
It was very calm. Your father, the generation, they more or less ran your life. You did what you were told. And it was a very pleasant place. But I had a very wonderful experience as a youngster. Even though my mother died when I was 6 years old, I think my dad did a pretty good job. At least I didn't end up in the reform school.
Now, things were kind of tough during the Depression. Do you recall
Yes,
what that was like?
Very much so. My father made about $165 a month. I thought he was a millionaire. So I never really personally was affected by the Depression as some would be. He had a job on the railroad as an engineer, and then my brother followed him. But I didn't want that. So after I got out of high school, I looked for something else.
I see. So you went to primary, middle school, and high school all in this area?
Yes. I went to Lakeview Grade School, and junior high was called Central, and went to Nampa High School, which in those days were located where now the city offices and the big center is down there. Well, that's where it was.
Do you recall how many people were in your graduating class?
Yes, 650.
So this was a fairly well-populated area even then.
Wait just a minute. I'm giving you the wrong figure. 650 was the total high school. I had about 265 in the senior class.
Okay. And do you recall having any interest in aviation at that time?
Well, yes. I was interested in aviation because every time I would get through Central High and I'd head home, there was a Richfield service station right across from the old library. And it put out every week what they call Tailspin Tommy. And I couldn't wait until I could get my hands on that read. And that's what got me interested in aviation. And then I started coming out here to the old Ritchie Field. And I forget his first name, but Mr. Clark was the airport manager and was for before the war and quite a few years after the war.
And what did you do? Just hang out or try to do little odd jobs?
Well, I came out here to be a part of it. I didn't know what I'm doing. One day, there was a plane I saw flying around I'd never seen before. So my dad knew that I was interested in aviation, but he told me, I don't want you flying an airplane. So I didn't say no or yes, but honestly, I knew I was going to fly one. So I went out, and he was talking to somebody, and I grabbed up a rag, and I was wiping the windshield down and doing all sorts of stuff. Finally, he said, "Kid, get in the airplane. We're going to fly around Nampa and try to drum up some trade, get people interested." And they did.
Now, this is just someone who'd flown into the airport?
Yes.
And what was his name?
What it was a plane, one of the planes of Admiral Byrd used when he went to the North Pole. I don't remember whether this pilot did or not, but at least he was flying one of Admiral Byrd's planes. And they were doing anything they could to make a living. That's what he was. And why he picked Nampa, I don't know.
So you
or if I did know, I don't remember.
You tried to make yourself useful. You started wiping his plane down.
Yeah. And from that, he said, and after about, a good week, well, he started letting me get on the controls and teach me how to fly it and what it meant. One time, I'd been up, several times with him, and finally he said, "Kid, I want you to fly the plane." So he took it in and landed it. He got out and he said, "I want you to take it off, fly the traffic better, and come back in and land." And that's what I did. In those days, when we turned on our base leg, we had to make 245s because of that big smokestack that was the Carnation Milk Factory. So I knew that, I obeyed that. Come on in and land. And he said, "Well, son, I decided I'd let you fly solo because if you're going to kill yourself, I don't want to be in it." And he laughed. Seemed like all pilots used to say that.
And you were how old then?
14.
14.
And
Wow.
I had to wait until I was 16 to get my license, or admit that Mr. Clark knew I was flying. He knew what was going on.
Did you manage to get a few more lessons after that?
Yes, he taught me a little bit about aerobatics. I wasn't quite ready for that, but then after about a couple of weeks, he left and I never saw him again. But I knew I wanted to be a pilot. It didn't frighten me. It just seemed the natural thing to do.
Now, when you graduated from high school, what did you have in mind doing at that point?
Well, war was on in Europe, and I knew sooner or later I'd be in the service, whether I chose to or not. And they talked about the draft. It hadn't been started yet, but in 1941 the draft did start. But I was already in the service by then. Well, I thought I could just apply for flying school and get it. Well, you had to have 2 years of college or pass equivalent tests. And I took a look at the test and knew I'd never pass that. But at the latter part of I'd say about in October, they weren't getting the number of young males to volunteer for the flying cadet program. So they opened it up to the enlisted personnel who were already in the service, and just have a high school education. That was all right. But you'd graduate as a flying sergeant or a staff sergeant.
I see. So where were you exactly on December the 7th, 1941? You were already in training?
Field, California. I'll never forget the day. I was working. It was Sunday morning, and I had to work all night. And I was getting ready to go have breakfast when they informed us that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And of course, we all knew where Pearl Harbor was because it was in the news every day. And from that point on, and then I had already put in for flying school, and shortly thereafter, like 3 weeks, I was selected and went to Ryan School of Aeronautics at Hemet. Your first phase was run by civilians. Your instructor pilots were all civilians too, and they were employees of Ryan.
The initial flight training you had, that must have been fairly easy to you since you knew how to fly an airplane already?
Yes, I tried to disguise it that I didn't know how. So if I made a little mistake, well, it would be natural. I was afraid if he knew it, he'd expect me to be perfect.
There was a high washout rate at that time, I assume?
Yes. If you ground looped an airplane, the wash ride followed. No matter how well you did in the wash ride, you're through. So I'll tell you something, you got on right rudder hard when you came in. Now, the Ryan had not awfully wide, but fairly wide, where the people that had to fly the Stearmans, they said they were more aerobatic, but they're easier to ground loop. So I made sure, especially around 30 hours, you didn't ground loop an airplane. You were gone.
I see. And then did you then go on to advanced training?
Yes. I ended up in Lemoore, California. It's now a Navy air base. But those days it was a newly made basic flying school. You flew BT-13s. We called them the Vultee vibrator.
At what point did you know which path you were going to take, single engine, multi-engine, or other types?
When I got 50 hours, the last 10 hours would be spent more or less what you were going to do when you graduated from flying school. And what I say is, he asked me, do you want single engine, which in those days was pursuit, now called fighters, or do you want multi-engine, twin engine or multi-engine? So I picked pursuit. They had an AT-6 there, so I would get in the AT-6 in the rear cockpit, because in a fighter airplane with those inline engines, you're sitting back quite a ways from the engine. So they wanted you to get used to being that far away from the propeller, and it did help. And the AT-6 was a perfect airplane to fly. It forgave you. A BT-13, believe it or not, would not forgive you.
After AT-6s, then where did you go?
Well, then I was headed for Luke Field, which is right near Phoenix. And I put in for pursuit, and that's what I got. I had to probably end up flying P-40s or P-39s. The P-51 was being built for the British, believe it or not. Had a different name on it, but that's what it was. Well, we finally took it back because we realized with that laminar flow wing, it was going to be something super. So, but I never got there.
And so when was it determined what you would fly?
Well, when I graduated from basic, they called a meeting and said, we want all the aviation students to come down to the hangar. An aviation student was differentiated from an aviation cadet because we would graduate as enlisted personnel staff sergeant. Heck, I was already a staff sergeant, so it was not a promotion in rank. Where the cadets ever graduated as second lieutenants, but we lived together and flew together. Well, when I went to that meeting, they started talking about a glider pilot. And I didn't know much about it. I said, well, I don't want that. So they told me to go out and talk to this sergeant, give him my thoughts. I went out there and I told him, oh, I don't want this. Well, he typed up the orders anyway. I said, I already have an orders to report to Luke Field for advanced. And he gave me this, and I kept reading the orders, and it seemed like to me that my first orders were superseded by this glider pilot. So I was sitting there near the train in Phoenix, and here come a big weapons carrier out, or an Army 6x6 truck, and said, you a cadet? And I said, yes. You throw your bags in, I'll take you out the field. So I showed him the orders, and he said, take those glider orders that you're going to glider, just tear them up and throw them in the trash can. They won't know where you are anyway. Well, I didn't think that was legal to do that. So I ended up by going to Plainview, Texas. And that's how I got started to become a glider pilot. Not what I wanted, but I blame myself for giving in. I should have had a little more guts and tore them up and probably been flying fighters the rest of my life.
So on arriving at Plainview, Texas, I assume you saw a field full of gliders?
Well, no, it didn't have any gliders at all. They didn't have small gliders. So you know what you did? You flew Piper Cubs, and every landing was dead stick. So you were simulating what a glider would be. And only one thing happened there. It was kind of funny. Every landing we made had to be a dead stick landing. When you came in, dead stick. Dead stick. We didn't have mixture control on a Cub. You just had ignition. Turn the ignition off, pull your nose up to keep the prop from windmilling, and then glide in and land. And it got so, it was very easy to do. Well, I was a little more than 18, darn near 19. And I can remember asking somebody, said, where do you meet nice-looking girls? And they said, go to the Methodist Church. There's a lot of them in Plainview. So that's where I went. Well, one of the persons was standing there. He happened to be the postmaster of Plainview. And so he told me his name. I didn't mean much. But what I really wanted to meet was his daughter. Well, I did. They took me to their place for Sunday dinner. That's what it was all about, to give the little home life to the soldiers. So I told her one day I'd give her a ride. After I had about 6 or 7 hours to Cub, at that point you thought I can do anything in this airplane. In fact, it wasn't stressed for inverted flight. Didn't stop me from looping it though. And I always wondered, what if the wings had come off? What are you going to do then? Well, when you're 19, you don't give that much thought at all. Anyway, I told her I'd meet her at a certain place, a field, and she knew where it was, because her father had kind of an acreage there. It was about 3 acres and a cow or two and something like that. Anyway, I landed, and without thinking, it was automatic, I reached up and turned the ignition switch off. as I'm gliding out, how in the world am I going to get this started? So I landed and she come over. So I put her in the cockpit. I said, push down on the brakes. On the top of the rudder pedal, so you push down, that's the brakes. And I'm going to crack the throttle. I got to get out and pull the pop through to get it started. I thought maybe if I could hang out, I could do it, but I couldn't quite reach it. So the minute the thing started, she took her feet off the brakes and the plane started ground flipping. Well, I reached in and grabbed a hold of the big strut, reached in and pulled the throttle back. And of course it more or less stopped, but still. So then I went ahead and gave her a ride. But I flew her back and landed in her father's field in the back. It was easy. It was very smooth pasture land. So I guess that was my first experience of doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing.
When did you first encounter a glider then?
Okay, then our next phase was Fort Sumner, New Mexico, which was not a fort. That's the name of a town. It's where Billy the Kid, the famous desperado, was buried. Well, we flew sailplanes. A lot of people don't realize that sailplanes, if you have a gliding ratio of 23 to 1, that's 23 feet forward for every foot you drop. That's how they rate them. Then it's a sailplane. If it's a little bit less than that, it's called a glider. Most people don't realize that, but that's the difference between. They're both gliders in a way. One's just more super than the other one. So I went there, and we got 60 hours, and it was funny. It was serious. On our graduation, they towed you up to 10,000 feet. Be 5 of us together, all in trail. And you had to thermal soar. Now you're familiar with thermals and soaring. Well, down there in June, it gets hot. And you don't have to hunt for a thermal. They're all over the place. And I had to put the plane into a spin because it was redlined at 50 miles an hour. The wings come off. So they told us we towed up to 10,000 feet and we released over the little town of what they called Muleshoe, Texas. And had a highway leading from that directly to Plainview. So your navigation was already solved for you. But anyhow, when I got back to Fort Sumner, I was at 18,000 feet. They say you can't fly at that altitude without oxygen. Well, I never. If it did affect me, I wouldn't admit it anyway. But anyway, I got back. We had 3 kids that did not make it back. I don't know how in the world what happened. You couldn't avoid going up all the time. In a way, if you were going up and you couldn't stop, you couldn't put the nose down and just kill off all that. So they taught you to put it into a spin, like 30 turns to the left, then 30 turns to the right. And when you're in a spin, you're actually in a stall. And I keep forgetting that you're also a pilot, so you know. I'm sounding like I'm trying to teach you how to fly. But anyway, we got through with that. Then they had some trouble with the big CG-4A gliders. The tails came off.
Was that the first time you'd seen the CG-4?
Yes. And we took our advanced glider training in CG-4As. But they grounded them all. We didn't know what was going to happen to the program, so we sat around Albuquerque, New Mexico. Somehow they put us in a big pool at Kirtland Field. And for something to do, that was also a bombardier school. They said, if you guys want to, you can run the cameras when the students are practicing their bomb. And what they were flour sacks full of flour. And I can remember the first time I got one of the students, bombardiers, called me over and he said, I'll give you any whiskey you want if you'll do something favor for me. What's that? He said, turn the camera on early so that when I drop the, or excuse me, turn it on late so that when the smoke drifted towards the target, then that's where you turn the camera. It looks like the bomb hit inside the circle. And first place, school knew that.
So you would just ride along on bombers and man the camera.
Played along with it. Well, then they finally released it, the glider. And so, and immediately when I graduated, I went to Louisville, Kentucky. Absolutely the wildest town I've ever been in my life. I won't get into detail, but and for a young boy being from Nampa, Idaho, I wasn't ready for that. But in any event, going there seemed like I was always meeting a girl. Anyway, I met this girl. I was not married then, and my wife knows all about this. This girl was coming back from vacation, Christmas, and so she sat right across from me, and we kept looking at one another. Finally, I got up to go into the club car, because that's where all the drinking was going on, the dancing, and she said, you don't want to go back there. They're drinking back there. I said, oh, you're right. So I sat down with her and talked. Well, I got acquainted with her. I said, well, if I'm ever stationed in Missouri, she was going to Stevens College at Columbia, Missouri. I said, I'll give you a call. A week later, I'm calling her from Sedalia, Missouri. I'm stationed there. So I started visiting her. And but I got put in a ferry squadron, and that was going to all these CG-4A factors. First one we went to was LaGuardia. And what was the name of the factory? Steinway Piano Company. They were making them because they were experts in plywood and laminated wood. And by the way, they had, if all the choice, I would like the Steinway glider better than the rest of them. They were better made, more, very particular. Just like they finished their piano.
Lenny, we have a model of the Waco CG-4A here. Maybe you could point out a few of the characteristics of it.
Well, first place, the nose of it was on a hinge. And if you were carrying a Jeep, you took a cable up over the top and hooked the Jeep. So right before we landed, especially if you're carrying a Jeep, we unlocked the nose locks when we were still in the air. And we did that because somehow that Jeep broke loose. I didn't want it to be slamming into my back, because that Jeep was about a foot from you, less than a foot.
So the idea behind that would be what? It would push you out then?
Well, what happened was, if the Jeep did break loose, it pulled the nose up, clear up, and this ended up clear up on top. Now you're laying back like that up on top.
Oh, I see.
Otherwise, you got out of the glider before you started it. But as the Jeep went forward, the nose came up. By the Jeep power, it came up. That's how you unloaded it.
Okay. So it was really something to contend with, having all that weight behind you.
Yeah. So I never had one ever break loose, but a lot of guys did. Usually rough landing possibly would do it.
Mm-hmm. Now the actual construction of the glider, which parts were
well, the
laminated
floor
wood?
of it was about 3 layers, different layers of plywood. And it was, now I've kind of forgotten what, it wasn't just plain pine, but each layer of pine was also made many, obviously very thin layers. And then you get one layer about that thick, then they run them one forward, next one crossing, next one forward. That made it very thin. So that thing would support a Jeep or a 75 millimeter gun, or 13 people if you're just carrying troops. They had 2 doors on them, right here and the one on the other side underneath the wing.
I see.
Right behind the strut. And the door was like this.
And that was so they could get through with their packs and jump out. I have a photograph here of a typical configuration showing a glider in flight, looking forward with the pilot and co-pilot, and how the troops would sit. So I'm sure you were happier having troops behind you than a Jeep or some heavy piece of artillery.
I might mention that the glider had a place right up here where that's where the big metal hook that came in and the jaws, put it in the jaws. If for some reason you hit the release, now you always release from the tow ship. You didn't want him releasing because there's a lot of tension. And this nylon tope is that big but very strong. And it had a big hook on the other end. If he released it, here come that tope, and before you could bat an eye, it's come right through the nose of that glider. So you had to be on alert for that. So a lot of people think the tow ship put what we call, they didn't put the rope in their face. That'd be the last one he ever put in my face, I'll tell you that. Not unless it's a good reason.
Now, a lot of sections of this were just canvas, I assume. So there wasn't much protection at all.
I tell you something funny about it. You can notice the landing gear. French farmers could take that landing gear off of that CG-4A and take the big wooden wheels they had on their ox carts and put those things on, and merci, they'd thank you for them. I never saw how, and they couldn't have seen the gliders before, but in minutes they had them off and on their ox cart, and we didn't care. It was all right.
Well, let's get back to when you were actually sent overseas. What year was that?
I went overseas in 1943.
Okay, and were you transported by ship?
I went to North Africa, and I didn't realize that's where I was going. Anyway, there was 50 of us on a ship called the Mauritania. Anyway, we went over there, and we ended up by supporting the British going into Sicily. And we were not there very long, because they evacuated us and brought us back to England, and we started preparing for D-Day months in advance.
I see. Were the British flying these, or were they flying their own gliders?
They had the glider, and we were supposed to back them up. Well, I ended up, most of the American glider pilots just took the darn thing over and flew it, because They obviously weren't trained very well. They could fly just as well as we did, but they didn't know anything about the glider.
Mm-hmm. So,
And they wanted to put it in a steep dive, because that's the way they were taught. In the British horse glider, they got tremendous flaps on them. You can put them straight down and not reach 100 miles an hour with those flaps.
I see. So let's just talk about when you got sent to England. Where were you stationed in England?
Well, when I got overseas, I was stationed about right there, 60 miles west of London, a little town called Newbury. They had a larger town, that's where we always went to, called Reading, but we were stationed about right there and very close to the Thames. It sounds like it should be Thames, but it's Thames River.
And how did you get on with the British?
Well, I got along fine. For one thing, they talk slightly different, but I enjoyed England much more than France. At one point, I really didn't care for France very much.
Did your training intensify at this point? Were you doing a lot of preparation?
And about 2 months before D-Day, I'd say about March, we found out the lead squadron in each group, like the 438th group, the lead squadron is the 87. I was in the 87. Then next group, then you had 87, 88, 89th, and 90th. And then 91st would be in the 439th group. Anyway, we flew British horse gliders. The reason why, we had a mortar outfit. They had a Jeep and a trailer. And the trailer was filled full of mortars and mortar ammunition. Now, if you're in a CG-4A, this glider, and you got another, the glider, your wingman, he's got the trailer, you got the Jeep, you have to land close together. If you're not, you're running for hours trying to find your darn... So they didn't want that. They didn't want to have to put up that. So we want you to use, and these were ground people telling us this, they used horse gliders. We could put a Jeep and a trailer and 27 airborne troopers in there. Now that way overloaded it. And the way, we had a very scientific way, Barry, of determining if a load was in the center of gravity. You jumped up in the air and grabbed a hold of the tail skid, and if the tail come down like this, that meant you were tail heavy. If it hardly come down at all, that means your nose heavy. Or if it came down in the middle, about like that, very scientific way.
But it worked. So were there a lot of cases of these being overloaded?
I discovered my glider, and the runways were 11,000 feet long. I discovered my glider was not loaded properly. It was too far back, that much. So I said, I told him, hold this thing up until I can get the glider and don't, if you can't take off as they hook onto you, go a little ways and kick left rudder, disconnect. I didn't want to do that. I trained too long. So I told all the 27 troopers, get forward. It was still tail heavy. The tow ship normally took off after you. In a CG-4A, you always got off for the tow ship. Then you held it down the glider down as close to the ground as you could. If you didn't, you pull his tail up and he can't ever get off the ground. So with that horse, he got off the ground, and I told him what the problem was, because I've got a telephone wire hooked around the tow rope, and I'm talking to the telephone to him like that. And I told him what the problem was, but I said, as you're climbing, you're doing it very slow. It took us 2 hours and 30 minutes of forming to get a glider train of over 200 miles long going into Normandy. And I thought to myself, God, I'm glad I'm not a German. How would I like to face something like that? I mean, and many a German general said, I'd given anything to have the supplies the Americans had, or the Allies had. Well, anyway, we moved that glider. But before I got off, I finally got the thing off and had them running up. I finally got the darn thing off, but as we got off, we ran off the runway at the end, and they had a road going down there, and they were putting CG-4As together. That was an assembly thing. The tow plane pilot said, GL, if you do not get off by that building down there on your right, you hit the release. Because if you don't, you're going to get the rope in your face, because you're going to pull him. He can't get off the ground. You pull him in and kill everybody. So I said, well, I wouldn't do that. I mean, anyway, about that time I got off, and I went right through the top of those tall trees. Why they didn't cut those trees down at the end of the runway, I don't know. We complained about it all the time, and I finally had to go through them. It didn't really do anything. It just tore a couple holes underneath the glider and that. As we were climbing out, I moved the Jeep forward, one rung as we called it. Then I said, no, half you guys now run back, get back here, because otherwise now we got it way too nose heavy. So then we undid the trailer and moved it very slowly and latched it down, and that tail come up, and I had the sinking feeling in my stomach for an hour and a half. That's how long it took. You know, when you're just mushing all the time, it finally starts getting to your stomach a little bit. We finally got it straightened out. Well, when I came in, I found out very quick I had to keep up 90 miles an hour airspeed or I'm going to stall. I was overloaded 3,000 pounds. Well, I'll tell you, I wasn't very old, but it didn't take me very long to know what I had to do. So I kept my flaps up, and I put that nose down. And I came in at 100 miles an hour, way too fast normally. And I picked a spot, and you go to the end. Go to the end of the field you're going to land, because if you don't, sure enough, somebody's going to run right into your mine or land on top of you. So I got cleared out the end, and when I got where I wanted to laugh, then I discovered there's water in this field. We were told not to land there because it was mined. Well, when they got to the point that we were supposed to land, they had like telephone poles stuck in all over the place. So we had to land here. Well, it's dark, as you can see that picture. It's still somewhat dark. This turned out, this was the savior. When they flooded us, they didn't think we would be dumb enough to land in water. Well, we were, and it turned out a blessing. We didn't have one glider pilot in my squadron hit going into D-Day. the 88 Squadron, which flew the CG-4As, and a field right next to us just got hell shot out of them. A number of them were killed. So
now the painting shows a chute deployed. That was popped right at the last minute.
That really slows you down. And I deployed it. I didn't need to. I came in at 100 miles an hour, and when I picked the spot I wanted to land, I had the co-pilot put those barn door flaps. I mean, they're big. We went from 100 miles an hour to 50 so quick you can, just like hitting a wall. I hadn't flown enough to know what to do, but maybe death stared in your face, you do. Anyway, I came in real fast because I knew if I didn't, I'd stall. So I landed the thing. When he hit that water, I didn't roll, I'll bet 15 feet and stop. Now the idea was get the hell out, excuse my French, get the hell out of that glider now and dig a foxhole or down until we know where the enemy is, where the fire's coming from, and then we'll proceed.
I see. So you evacuated the aircraft as quickly as possible and got down.
Turned out there was the Germans were occupied on the field next to us.
Now, this glider had to unload from the rear, is that correct?
It had what?
It had to unload from the rear?
No. Well,
your heavy equipment?
The middle of it, right behind this wing, was where it hinged. Now, the later models had a nice hinge on it, so you didn't have to take it apart. You unhooked the latch and just, and then had a ramp that went down from there, and then everything rolled out. But we had the older models. Our British comrades had the later model, which I don't blame them.
I see. Okay, so you ended up, I'll set this down now, thank you. You ended up in the water. How deep was the water?
Oh, it's up to my knees or more. No, it's about a little above my knees, about that far.
I see. So it wasn't a real
No,
problem.
we kind of pushed the Jeep and stuff out to high ground, and then from that way we didn't have any trouble getting it started.
So this was how far behind the invasion beaches?
We were 11 miles.
I see. And the mission was to what? Secure some bridges?
We actually went over Utah Beach. Now, had it been Omaha Beach, that was the tough beach for the ground troops was Omaha. But if you're flying in a glider, they're both equal. I mean, they're not. We went in 11 miles. We had a number of places to land, and we knew where they were. They had mosaic maps showing, we know every farmer's name. Believe it or not, we did.
And once you got out of the glider, what was your responsibility at that point?
Set up the command post. And we overshot it a little bit in the dark. Went kind of by it where it was. And I got into the actual town of St. Mary, which is a very small burg.
When your glider landed, you were only about a mile and a half or so away from Saint Mary Glisse, the famous French town. And we're looking right now at the church, Saint Mary Glisse, and this was made famous by a paratrooper who got hooked up on the top.
Right up the top.
Yeah. Now you got involved in getting him down, I understand.
Well, I was laying in a grove of trees, and I shouldn't have been where I was, but there I was. And Germans were not moving out, but they were moving around quite a bit, and they left this area and went back towards the landing area. And so I ran over and went up to the church, and I ran into a couple of Catholic nuns. American. And this one said, I know you're American. Anyway, I went up there and I told him how to get up. So she actually took me up and showed me. Well, he's hanging over here, so this window here, I remember. I said, how do I open that? Never does it. And she opened it for me. And I kept, twice I'd carried a rope up, and where that rope come, somebody cut it off, and there it was laying there. So and it was about 30 feet long. So I put a knot into it and threw it over to him, and he just grabbed it and tied it around his stomach area. And then I had the other end of it, and they got a older man. They were hiding in there. They didn't know what was going to happen. So he kind of clawed himself to that, and he kept pulling him over until we got him through into the window and got him down. And the first thing he did was take that jump boot off.
The Germans, I understand, had been shooting at him?
He took his boot off because it was itching. He'd been he kept hitting him there, and it made his foot itch. So I thought, buddy, we got to get out of here. Anyway, then he knew where approximately his squad was, so he took off. I didn't.
How long had he been up there? Quite a long time.
Probably 4 hours.
Okay.
Yeah, it's quite a ways. But what happened before we got there, we finally got the Jeep high ground, and we knew we'll go around this road a little ways. We'd run into the big barn that we were going to use as a command post. Just before they got there, I heard this voice, "Alt." Not halt, but alt. And I thought, oh, God. So this is combat. I knew they were Germans. There was 51 of them. I thought, well, I'm trying to get my bayonet on, and I was not trained with a Gran. I trained with the Springfield, and I was having trouble getting the darn bayonet on the end of my rifle. They said in close quarters, you got to have that on. Stick them in the stomach. It'd been kind of tough for me to do that because I didn't really hate them. But anyway, he said halt, and he started filing out of that. And the guy that was driving it slammed the Jeep in gear and floorboarded. Knocked two of us off the Jeep. I was one of them, and a full-blooded Iroquois Indian, and left it. We called him Big Chief Matoxin. He had full Indian headdress. He'd get drunk and put that on, and his commanding officer would leave the base. He kept threatening he's going to kill him. Anyway, they come out, and finally the leader of it grabbed me and started saying, "Ruski, Ruski, Ruski." Well, it turned out a lot of them were foreigners, been forced into the German army. They'd killed their German sergeant, and they were waiting there to give up. So things are not quite like Ted Malone tried to picture it as a pitched battle went on hours, and by cunning and all this, I was able to overcome the enemy. Well, it didn't quite happen that way.
So did you end up taking these people as prisoners?
So I told Big Chief, I said, do you want up in the front or in the back when we march them down this road? He said, right away he became very Indian on me. He said, Indian never puts his back to the enemy. He didn't want me up there. I said, okay, Big Chief. So I got up there. All the time I'm talking to this guy, and he did understand some English. So I said, I got him in this. Now I said, you guys stay here. Do not leave here. And I'm going to inform the airborne as I run into. that you're in there. And so I started going back to where that Jeep would be. And you couldn't believe this. This one that I'd been talking to opened the window, climbed through it, dropped to the ground, and run down the road and said, "You didn't leave us any food." Well, about that same time, I found a whole bunch of K rations that had been dropped.
So you're able to
And
give
I
them
picked
food.
up a whole bunch of them and started throwing it to them, and they got enough for every one of them. It was more, probably a couple hundred in this big bundle.
Mm-hmm.
And he dropped them all over, so you had food anywhere you turned.
Great.
Well, anyway, I didn't see those guys again.
Lenny, after Normandy, I understand you were given some leave. You went back to England, and what was your assignment after that?
Okay, they wanted to get all the salvageable gliders, CG-4As, out of France back to England, where they could, anyone that had to repair, minor repairs, they'd do it. Oh, I don't know, in 2 days we must have gotten 100 out of there. I don't know, out of maybe 600 or 700. Some of them were damaged after they got on the ground. Some of them were set on fire because somebody was cold. Unbelievable. But anyway, we used the snatch mechanism. Simply, we radioed a C-47. He was circling all the time, telling him we found a glider. We put up a flag, and then he could see where we were talking about it. Like the glider would be pointed straight forward, at an angle of about 20 degrees would be two big fiberglass, well, it wasn't fiberglass, I guess it was aluminum poles, went up in the air about 20 feet, and had a rope with a big loop on it, and then the main part of the rope come back and hooked into our glider. A C-40, as we're parked like this, a C-47 come along and hit this rope, and when it got about like that, his rope, his end of it, was on a great big drum. And the minute it tripped that drum, it started releasing rope. Because if you didn't, you'd break it in two. And it would jerk you in the air, and it'd be about like this. And you were in the air. And you didn't do one thing or another. You held the wheel as just solid. And then you get up above the glider or the tow ship to get out of the prop wash. And he'd circle twice. How's it feel? Fine. Back across the channel we'd go.
Huh. And did you make for one particular base where they were repaired?
I made 3 trips in one day.
Gee, that's
And
something.
And that night, 9 o'clock, I'm dancing the Reading Town Hall.
That's a day's work.
Anyway, that's what we did. In the meantime, the southern France invasion come up. So we're going down like this, the southern France invasion. And we couldn't fly over Spain. So we had to go like this, back down to where in Africa, and then back up over Sardinia, and about 60 miles north of Rome, called the little town of Camina. They had a strip there, quite long, hard sand. And we flew gliders out of Rome, right straight across. And right about it was close to Nice, that's where we landed. Most beautiful country in the world. You go into those places. We didn't stay there very long.
Now, there was active fighting going on there. You were
Well,
landing behind the lines?
We wanted to chase the Germans knew we were coming, and they started evacuating. It took me 3 days before I saw the first German. Some of them, depending on where they landed, may have gotten it. I didn't. Then we came back to England. Well, about that time, Patton broke loose. And he's going across, here's the Cherbourg Peninsula, the little one up here. He's going like this, like the devil. So we started flying, and I ended up flying C-47s, gathering, because the power pilots were flying day and night. And a couple of them killed themselves. They just fell asleep. We had the last mission. We thought it was a milk run, and you know what a milk run is. Very easy, enemy ready to give up, all those things. Well, it was the worst mission of the whole war for us. 39 out of 60 are killed.
And this was going into which area?
This was going into Wesel, Germany.
Okay.
And
this is where you were wounded? Is that correct?
pardon?
Were you wounded on this mission?
Yes, I was wounded in the back, and my co-pilot got killed. And a very good friend of mine from Malad, Idaho, Chuck Stevens, he's permanently disabled. He's in a chair and he lives in Las Vegas, and his sister lives in Boise, and an aunt of his came out from Illinois to interview me because Chuck had written a book.
So this was March of 1945?
Yes, March the 24th of 1945, I believe, was the date we went into Wesel. And that wound had happened right on the landing. They waited until you got within 50 feet of the ground, and they just cut those gliders. What weapons they had, they looked like .50 caliber, but that's Allied stuff. Probably a millimeter, but it was equivalent of the shells are about that long. When they hit you, boy, they just tore you apart. Well, they had 4 barrels and a great big iron half loop like this, and you can raise or lower those things. You can fire them just like this, cut trees down, anything. And I tell you, it was vicious.
So were you evacuated?
Within 3 hours, though, we started killing everybody. And then when they saw that, then they threw their weapons down. But the damage had been done. We lost quite a few people. A lot of C-47s were shot down. That was their own fault, though. We had a big arrow. When you drop your load, your stick of paratroopers or your glider, turn left. This way is not protected. We haven't got that yet. And every plane that went right got it. Every plane that went left got back safely.
Were you evacuated to England?
Yes. They took us. They said, first thing they said, you got to get back across this Rhine River. You get down to somewhere in here. Had to get across the Rhine anyway. I can't quite tell by this map, but anyway, they said, how are we going to get back? That's miles. Well, if I was there, I'd steal a bicycle. So we started picking up bicycles. We must have had 4,000 of them stacked in piles. And the Germans knew where they were, the peasants. So they went back up there and got their bike and went back. We just borrowed them long enough to get up there. Then Army 6x6 picks us up and took us back. And that's how we got back to, I went in Coulomiers, from Coulomiers. I was actually stationed at Reims, but then they combined our group and squadron with another that was at Coulomiers. And those runways were like, 400 to 500 feet wide, 13,000 foot runways, and they had darn near 3,000 gliders, all massed. And if you were the first one to take off, you had to get in the air in a hurry, because the guys in the back here were miles, it seemed like.
Where were you at the end of the war in Europe?
Right at the end of the war, I was in Amiens.
Okay. So that's
Then they started sending us to places called Camp Luckestrai, Camp Camel, and that was the Antwerp estuary. And we got on troop ships. In fact, President Truman was going to the Potsdam, and he was on the Augusta cruiser coming up there, and we all lined up, stood up and said, "Give him hell, Harry," and he goes,
So now you've brought in these beautiful shadow boxes with your medals and so forth. Maybe you could just briefly tell us what these are. Here's a Purple Heart.
This is the Purple Heart. Now, part of these things, this was what we were in. They finally formed the first Allied Airborne Army. You had paratroopers, you had glider infantry, as well as airplane power pilots. So that was our patch, and we were in the troop carrier. You can see a parachute as well as a glider in it. Then this was our glider wings. When I graduated, somehow I just discovered recently that my wings are sterling silver. So that's how they come to shine. This here is the Air Medal, which I've earned about 5 times. American Defense, and this is the American something ribbon. I put that on there because I wanted to decorate it up, to end it. Then I started getting into the Guard, National Guard. I flew in the Army Guard, L-20s, L-16, stuff like that. And this is the Presidential Citation. This is the little thing that represents the Air Corps, I call it. I've got some more than that. I just haven't put them on there.
Now, in addition,
this, the Dutch government give us what they call the orange lanyard. Now, orange is everything to them. Their national color is orange. They call it the orange lanyard, and that's thank you for liberating Holland.
And here's a picture of you.
That's when I graduated from flying school.
Great. Now, subsequently, you've gone to some reunions, and I understand you got this.
We belong to the WW2 GPA, World War II Glider Pilot Association. And when we have our annual meeting of all the glider pilots, we gather. That year, we gathered in Tucson, Arizona. Dale Oliver, he's also had been an artist for Disney Studios, drew this. He always did a lot of, in fact, he did the picture of my glider going into Normandy.
That's terrific.
He loved to do things like that. He's got a whole book of that stuff.
Great. Well, that's been really quite a military career. Now, I understand after the war, you got involved with the Olympic Games in Los Angeles?
Yes. I did that because, in the telephone company, I happened to be transferred to Pocatello. And some of the coaches at Idaho State University, which I didn't go to Idaho State, but I'd become well acquainted with them, when they left there and they developed this training ground at Colorado Springs for the whole Olympic movement, they asked me, why don't you serve as the chairman of the Idaho Olympic Committee, which I did for a while. And it was, but I finally had to give it up. I was within the telephone company. I was being transferred so much, but it was very enjoyable. That's how I got involved with the Olympics. And because of that, when we had the torch run in '84, well, I ended up by getting appointed to manage the thing.
Could you show us the torch that you carried?
They had two sizes torch. One was for the runners that ran only a YLK or kilometer. I had to carry the one about that long because it had to have more propane in it. And this thing would literally, I had that jet open, that had propane in it, it came out. And then you tip it like this, and you light it from another one. But there's an eternal flame always burning.
And you transported that from where to where?
We had an army going down the highway, only there wasn't an army. They were all connected with the Olympic game, the torch run, and the belt system, and the telephone pioneers. We have retired people practically in every town in this country. So they had literally thousands of free employees.
That's
I had
terrific.
a job basically of Idaho, getting it through Idaho, but I also stayed on and went clear into the Coliseum with it. Anyway, this is something a guy said that he said, I'll give you $10,000. He said, no, I'll give you $100,000. I said, I wouldn't trade that for the amount of money in the world.
Now, Lenny, there are some other items you brought in, a couple of hats. One is for the Silent Wings Museum, which is in, did you say Lubbock, Texas?
Yes.
Where glider pilots?
This represents our Silent Wings Museum in Lubbock, Texas. And this is one of many hats that shows that simply the wearer was a combat glider pilot.
Mm-hmm. And here we have the Olympic symbol
and that's
from
part
LA.
of the Olympic torch, and that was the eagle that was the mascot of that '84 Olympics.
And this, I understand,
this is
a billfold?
a leather billfold that I don't want to use because I don't want it scarred up or anything.
That's terrific. And this, I understand, was presented to you.
This is a replica of the torch, shows a man and a woman, and it was worth about $365 originally. Of course, the worth of it was because it represents something important. I've been offered more money for it than now, but
And I understand you have a little human interest story also to share with us.
Yes. Before I came back from overseas, I went with a girl and a very nice girl in Reims, France. Her mother would never let me take her daughter out without being escorted by her mother. Finally, she informed me that you have passed the test. She didn't say it that way, but that's what she meant. Anyway, I was sitting in the front room with them talking, And she kept mentioning her brother, and she hadn't seen him since 1940. Well, the Germans had taken him as a political prisoner. They wanted him to work for them. But they've gotten word that he's in, not Stuttgart, but the same place that the big Volkswagen factory, I've now forgotten the name of it. But in any event, I said, well, good grief, that's where I go tomorrow, because my job then